There's always been one detail of this story that has always bothered me. It's not the doubt. In fact, doubt, I think, is such a central part of faith. In many ways, doubt is what empowers faith. It's what gives it its energy. Faith is not certainty. And in fact, if you're certain about something, I'd be very careful. So it's not the doubt that bothered me in this story. What has always bothered me about this story is that the risen Lord, who's come back from the dead and appears among the disciples, still bears the wounds of his crucifixion. Think about that. Jesus, nailed upon the cross, a spear stabbed in his side, is raised from the dead, and he still has those wounds. Doesn't make sense to me. I would think resurrection life means the wounds are gone. You'd expect that. Resurrection is supposed to leave those wounds of crucifixion behind, but instead, in a resurrected form, he carries those wounds in his hands and in his side. And not only that, what's interesting is the proof of his resurrection to Thomas is the ability to touch those wounds. Thomas won't believe that Jesus is raised from the dead unless he actually touches those wounds. In fact, the very line is that he put his hand in his side. So it's not some scar, it is actually a wound, open. So open that Thomas can sink his fingers into it. That detail has never made sense to me. It's almost incomprehensible. The risen Lord bearing the wounds, open wounds of his very crucifixion. It seems kind of cruel to me, if you think about it. Brene Brown. Has anyone here ever heard of Brene Brown? Yeah, the psychologist and person to be interested in psychology. Brene Brown is a researcher, a professor of social work at the University of Houston, I believe is where it is. You can see her. She's given a TED Talk that's become rather famous. In fact, it's one of the most viewed TED Talks ever given, and it was titled The Power of Vulnerability. And what Brene articulated was, as a researcher, she was a researcher in the area of social work. She was interested in human connection. She argues that human connection is what drives us, that it is the basis of health and is this sense in which we connect to each other. And without that human connection, we're lost. And she says we're built for that. Our neurobiology is built for human connection with each other. And so she was interested in what disconnects us, what causes us to be disconnected. And she looked at all the hundreds of interviews and heard stories from folks who shared their disconnect in those times in which they were heartbroken. And over, she identified two things that drove human disconnection: shame and fear. Shame and fear. She argues that shame and fear we feel within our own hearts, that sense in which we feel like we don't measure up, to what others expect of us, whether that's a parent or whether that's a spouse or whether that's a friend or a total stranger. We are so driven by shame and fear that we will hide from those feelings. In fact, she argues we numb ourselves on drugs or busyness or activity because we don't want to face our woundedness, our shame and fear. In fact, one of the things she says is people who are really, people that those times when we are filled with shame and fear, one of the qualities beyond numbing ourselves is we will want to make certain what is uncertain, which is an interesting assertion in the context of our story this morning. The part of shame and fear that drives us means we think of faith not in terms of mystery, but of orthodoxy. I'm right, you're wrong. And she says the only way forward for those of us trapped in this shame and fear, and part of what's beautiful about her lecture is she shares her own struggles with those issues. The only way forward is vulnerability. That people who are wholehearted, people who find healing, are willing to be vulnerable in their woundedness. Are willing to be authentic, not about being perfect, not about being whole and complete, but being willing to offer to each other our own woundedness. I thought of that lecture when I was reading the story because you talk about fear and shame in that room, in that house. Shame, their leader, has been crucified, a crucifixion, a tool of shame by the state, shamed that they failed their Lord in the time he needed it most, shamed that they have lost everything. And we're told in the text, not only shamed, but they were so afraid. You talk about wounded people. And Jesus appears among them and says, "Peace be with you." Discovered a Franciscan priest named Richard Rohr. Many of you probably knew of him long before I did, but this past year especially I've discovered his writing. And one of the books I've read was a book called Falling Upward, in which he articulates that in our lives there are two parts of our lives. The first part usually is we build our lives. In a sense, we kind of grow and educate ourselves. We get jobs. We seek to create families. That the first part of life is this building up of our life. And the second part, and he doesn't give an age where the cutoff occurs, but the second part of life, he says, is the time in which we deepen that life we've built. And we deepen it, Rohr articulates, in the latter part of life, because that's when we start losing things. That's when we start, as he puts it, falling down. In the latter part of life, we lose loved ones, we lose friends. The latter part of life, we lose some of the physical vigor we had before. The latter part of life, we may lose some illusions we had about our own life. But Rohr says that that is the moment when we realize in that woundedness, God is there. It's when we fall down, Richard Rohr says, that we experience the grace of God surrounding us. And as he puts it, when we fall down, reality is we are falling upwards into God's arms. The truth is, it is in our woundedness, in our vulnerability, that we truly know God's infinite mercy. Years ago, while I was in seminary, I got to be good friends with another classmate, and while he didn't finish seminary, he decided God was calling him elsewhere. We maintained that friendship all 3 years I was in seminary. And it was about midway in seminary that he shared with me that he had recently discovered or recently uncovered inside himself that he was an alcoholic, which I found surprising. If anybody's been around someone who's an alcoholic, you know sometimes it's hard to recognize. It's hidden very, very well. But my friend, part of his journey was to share with me that he discovered and had uncovered that he was an alcoholic. And he invited me to his 1-year anniversary with AA, in which he would receive a chip. It was a celebration of this journey in which he had been sober for 1 year. And I had never been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I'd never been to one before. I had no idea. I'd heard vaguely about it, maybe seen something on television or movies. But that was the most incredible experience. Because it's a group of people who gather, and they tell the most horrific stories of woundedness imaginable. They are so vulnerable to each other. Tell stories of lost families, tell stories of great death and bankruptcy, and they are so honest about their brokenness, their woundedness. And I remember being overwhelmed in some ways by that honesty, by that vulnerability. I remember thinking, oh my God, I don't know that I could do this. But there was this amazing truth that as this community shared their woundedness in this vulnerable way, there was healing. There was a strength and courage to that vulnerability that inspired me. I'm going to try to remember the name of this. I discovered this. There is a artistic form called, it's a Japanese thing called kintsugi. You can Google it online. And kintsugi is a Japanese practice of taking pottery that has been broken and putting it together through a lacquer, kind of gold-plated lacquer. That in fact, many would articulate that pottery which had been unbroken, it looks even more beautiful with the cracks all through it, lacquered with the gold. And that image is one I take with me. I'm not called to be perfect. In fact, perfection is the enemy of goodness, I would say. We're called to a spirituality of woundedness, to embrace that brokenness in us, the cracks that are part of who we are, to accept it and have the courage to face those imperfections, to embrace those imperfections and wounds, because we know that's where the risen Lord resides. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.